Good afternoon, welcome back. And for anybody who's just coming in, we got plenty of room down in the front here in the main seats. So as promised before lunch, because you always want to end a day of complicated terrorist plots and everything else with, and after lunch we can get to the axis of resistance. So here we are. But decoding Iran's playbook, by the way, one of the best documents ever put out by the Soufan Center, because everything they wrote in there was fascinating, everything they wrote in there was true, and everything they wrote in that document, which was way before its time, actually happened in the order they said it would. So I highly recommend getting it. But it's going to be moderated by Marc Mazzetti, Washington investigative correspondent for the New York Times, and a guy who, when you see his byline, you stop reading everything else and you go right to that article because he breaks a lot of news. He'll be joined by Dr. Kenneth Katzman, Senior Fellow at the Soufan Center, Dr. Matthew Levitt, Senior Fellow and Director of Program on Counterterrorism at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Mr. Phillip Smyth, a researcher on Iranian proxies and Shia militias, which is a growth area right now, and I have to go slower on this one, Mr. Marc Polymeropoulos, former CIA Senior Intelligence Service and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Let's welcome our panel.
No time at the end for the panelists to discuss the Red Sox. So here we go. Iran's axis of resistance. I feel that this is a term that has become much more in the public post-October 7th. And while experts like you know about this and studied this before October 7th, I think even for an audience like this, we could begin a little bit definitionally and talk about what we're talking about with the term axis of resistance. So Phillip, you wrote an excellent piece, which I commend everyone for the CTC Sentinel at West Point, discussing the origins, how the axis of resistance operates. And so I'm going to start with you. For the audience, talk about the origins of the term. Is this a term that Iran uses? Is this a term that the groups use to discuss the relationship Iran? How did it come about?
So I can answer this in about 37 parts, if you don't mind. Easiest way to define this, Iran has used this and has used it as a marketing point for quite a while, that they were building out a larger axis where they try to market and say, these groups, they're technically autonomous. But they've also used this other kind of subcategorization where they also use Islamic resistance. So many of them fall under the Islamic resistance rubric, where the Islamic resistance is something like Lebanese Hezbollah, or Asaibah al-Haq in Iraq, or Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. Or I mean, even sometimes Hamas they'll throw under that as well. So it's kind of a mixed term in that sense. But they're trying to draw it out and make it broader. The resistance axis itself is pretty much any group that opposes the United States. That's been a major one. Any group that opposes the state of Israel. So they've even included North Korea in it at one point. They had graphics that they put out that were like that. They've had Syria, where they've definitely roped the Assad regime into the resistance axis and said they work. Yemen via the Houthis, they'll say that they're part of it. But in general, it is an Iranian-led compendium of different groups. So the vast majority of them are Shia militias, but I don't want people to think that this is merely a sectarian issue where it's just Shia groups. You have leftist organizations like the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the other alphabet soup of groups. And you also have Sunni groups, including Hamas, including the Mujahideen battalions in Gaza. So there are a lot of different organizations, sometimes even tribal groups that are included within this rubric.
So, I mean, as you've written, I mean, Iran has long used proxies, right, to carry out its strategic objectives. Is the idea that they're now using this as sort of marketing, billing this as an axis of resistance, is this part of their strategy to show their strength, to punch above their weight, to show that they are more to be feared because they have this semi-formal, collection of groups that sort of answer to them?
In part it is, but I think there is a serious side to what they want to do. And I think you can see this with how they cultivate different organizations, different groups, different proxies. They will fundamentally try to make more loyal proxies. And they don't care how small those kind of loyalist elements are so long as they keep getting more and more and more. If they can create different kind of umbrella groupings, then it's easier for them to kind of draw down and say, no, this is an actual serious axis of resistance that you have to face. It's not as complicated in the background as sometimes it is. I mean, I would add to this that there are other groups there that are not completely under their control, but I also think it's a bit of a misunderstanding from a lot of Western analysts that this is really an issue of complete control or no control, or autonomy or no autonomy.
I want to get into sort of the mechanics of how it works in a bit. I want to go to Matt, who wrote recently that basically Iran's external operations, Iran has ratcheted up its external operations. And you heard Lisa Monaco this morning, and I'm quoting her, say that Iran is in the midst of a relentless effort to project power in the United States. Now, you can take this U.S. part or whatever part of the external operations you want to handle, but I wanted you to explain a little bit about what, if anything, has changed in months, years regarding Iran's strategy using these groups.
So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here on this panel with all of you, and thank you to the Soufan Center. You're looking at an axis of resistance right here. You're looking at Red Sox Nation right here, so I'm not going to let that go. And if anybody wants to see pictures of Hezbollah members wearing Yankees hats, I have a collection that's on my phone. And if you look back at the last Hezbollah prosecution here in New York City, Southern District, in which I was the expert witness, Alexei Saab did surveillance in Washington, D.C., no sports. In New York, no sports, because there's no sports worthy. But when he went to Boston, did surveillance of beloved Fenway Park. Okay, so I'm just saying, you can go anywhere you want, but Yankees and Hezbollah. So
you're cut off.
Yeah. Look, Iran has been using external operations, assassinations, abductions, intimidation plots, and surveillance operations to support all of those since months after the revolution in 1979. One of the very first assassinations was in Bethesda, Maryland, not far from where I live, and it's continued apace ever since. But over the past few years, we've seen a huge spike in these activities. The turning point really was a failed bombing plot at a Mujahideen Khalq MEK rally outside of Paris. They used an Iranian diplomat based out of Vienna and some others in there. And at that point, they decided to change something. There's still cases where Iranians send their own operatives, where diplomats provide some support. But increasingly, they're trying to use some form of proxy. And increasingly, that proxy is not what you would have thought, like a Lebanese Hezbollah guy or an Iraqi guy. We're still doing that. You heard about the case of the Pakistani arrested here with ties to Iran, trying to carry out plots targeting senior American politicians. The Azeri Shia militant who was caught in Brooklyn with an AR-15 outside Masih Alinejad's house. We have those, but increasingly what we're seeing now is recruiting criminals. It's cheap. There's a lot of them who can do things. They're not squeamish about using extreme violence. And it provides them reasonable deniability. Reasonable deniability, by the way, doesn't mean that you don't know that they did it, but it means that it's more difficult for you to get support in your public, around your National Security Council table and among your allies to do something against Iran itself. And that for Iran right now is the only big red line. It's true for these operations. It's true for what they're doing in the region. They don't mind a regional war. They mind a regional war that will spill over into Iran. And so when they do these things abroad, it provides them that regional deniability and a little bit of protection or mitigation against a direct attack against them.
So we're talking about criminal organizations. I as much as I hate to admit it, there was an excellent piece in the Washington Post that quoted you and the use of criminals. And I'm wondering just how how these sort of contacts develop. How do they sort of nurture these ties with presumably non-religious criminal elements that are just basically can provide deniability, as you say, and sort of for the right price, I presume.
So there's all kinds of ways to establish these types of relationships. In one case, there was an Iranian who was arrested in the UAE, did a short amount of time in jail, and met someone else who was a criminal, and they leveraged that relationship for him to reach out to other criminals. In a whole bunch of instances, you have either Iranian criminals or criminals who have taken refuge in Iran. Some of them are dual nationals. A Hells Angels biker who's a German-Iranian citizen flees Germany because he killed someone to get his Hells Angels stripe. And the Iranians let him live in Iran so long as he provides some assistance. You maybe remember a case a little while ago where there were bullets shot through the windows of synagogues in Germany in the middle of the night in a firebombing plot. So that was this guy. There was a case in France and Germany just revealed last week, a major Turkish French dual national narcotics trafficker who's taken residence in Iran. And so this is one thing they're doing, allowing some of these people to live in Iran, but in return you have to do things for us. And some of them, they're Iranians. One of them was jailed in Turkey. They got him out of jail, let him come home, but in return you have to do some things for us.
So we've sort of had a sense of the scope of the problem from the West's point of view and the ratcheting of the external operations, which do, of course, impact the United States. Ken, I want to go to you to talk about, from the U.S. and European perspective, what has been done policy-wise to blunt the axis of resistance, what has worked and what hasn't. Yep.
Mike's now. I mean, it's a forward defense strategy by Iran is fundamentally what it is. They don't have any conventional weapons of any meaning. They're flying F-4s from 60 years ago. They don't have spare parts. They can't project power across the Strait of Hormuz to the Arabian Peninsula. So all they have are these militias that they've built into not just militias, but really political parties in Lebanon, and now we're seeing it in Yemen, in Iraq, which are able to advance up the political ladder to become decision makers and in some cases kingmakers in the countries where they are. And that allows Iran to mobilize tentacles and elements and project power for Tehran. So that's the strategic objective for Iran. Now, in case of the United States, you're asking about US policy. There are certain policies that have been successful, and there are certain policies that have not. Now, President Obama imposed quite a few sanctions on Iran's oil industry, particularly, with a very specific goal of getting Iran to the nuclear bargaining table. And there was broad European support for it, broad world support for it, and it succeeded. He drove Iran's oil sales down very, very low, and Iran did bargain away key aspects of its program, or at least agree to limit them for a time frame. Now, then the United States left the nuclear agreement, and that fractured the global consensus, and now there is not a consensus to keep tight sanctions on Iran. So China is buying China is basically buying all of Iran's available exports. They're almost buying 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day at this point, which is keeping Tehran's economy afloat. And China, because the US left the nuclear deal, China does not feel bound to comply with the sanctions, and it's buying this oil, and that's keeping Tehran afloat. So in certain circumstances, sanctions can be effective when there's broad compliance and agreement with them, but when the world is not united to impose the sanctions, they are generally not effective. Now, you know, we can obviously talk about other options. You know, the axis of resistance is very, very long on threats and bluster, and very, very short on any actual capabilities. And we can talk about that, but there are other tools in the U.S. tool chest that could be used, perhaps more broadly.
Well, talk a little bit about the sort of lack of capabilities, you say. Capabilities to project beyond the Houthis in Yemen, the
Look, I mean, Iran launched 330 missiles at Israel in April, and the United States, Israel, and some moderate Arab states basically intercepted all of them. Hezbollah just launched 250 rockets and missiles at Israel and hit nothing. They are not that capable. They are very shrill. They make a lot of threats. They are very motivated and a lot of propaganda and a lot of threats, but fundamentally at the end of the day, when President Biden said we're going to send an Ohio-class submarine off the coast of Iran, Khamenei was like, okay, let me settle down. That's the message I wanted to communicate.
Marc, you spent a number of years in the Middle East as a case officer, sort of dealing with the impact of these groups, seeing their operations, working with intelligence partners in the Middle East. I wanted to see from your perspective what you see as the sort of efficacy of these groups, this so-called axis of resistance, and from a sort of intelligence side, a blunting them side, what is most effective?
So I like to call this the axis of resistance to the axis of resistance. And so, so often when you think about what CIA does, and a lot of people here have experience working in some fashion with the agency, but a CIA station, a case officer, does a couple things. One is you recruit unilateral sources, and that's kind of the sexy thing you see in espionage movies. And that is only a small part of your job. The other part of your job is you work with a host country, and that's what we call partnerships. And that's at the Atlantic Council, we're involved on a project on this, and the importance of partnerships, particularly when we're talking about countering Iran and her proxies. And what does this mean? For the United States, it's pretty clear. We will have intelligence exchanges with our partners, capacity building, resources, equipment, and sometimes operational work together. And I think you look at the U.S.-Israel alliance right now, and sorry to mention the Washington Post, but the Washington Post, I think, has written quite extensively on this partnership, what they're doing with the fusion cell, for example, at the embassy in Israel, hunting high-value targets as well as looking for the hostages. So really, really important there. And so the U.S. has this role, and I saw this very clearly in working with the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Palestinians. Really kind of remarkable work we did over my career. But the other part of this, in terms of partnerships, which I think is really, really important and fundamental to understand how we will, in essence, fight back against Iran and her proxies, is the partnerships between Israel and the Arab states. And it's something that is not, I don't think, gets enough attention. I think it's foundational to the bilateral relationships, the actual overall relationship Israel enjoys with Arab allies, and sometimes even kind of that things that are not kind of overt in public. And that's absolutely critical because I think both sides see it as part of their security umbrella. I always love telling stories and give anecdotes, and this is back in 2000, maybe 10, 11 years ago, I was walking through GID headquarters, the Jordanian Intelligence Directorate. I walked through the headquarters and I heard a helicopter landing. And I thought, okay, the king must be coming. Oftentimes, King Abdullah would come visit GID. And as I walked around the corner, who do you think I ran into? Benjamin Netanyahu, who was coming just because that Jordanian-Israeli relationship is absolutely fundamental to the security of both countries. And I never forgot that moment. And let's fast forward to, for example, post-October 7. That you have the Jordanian foreign minister, you have the king, you have the queen of Jordan in public very angry about what's going on in Gaza. But a friend of mine just returned from the region. He had gone to see GID officials, and I said, what was the message from GID to Israel? And he said, keep going. And so that's what's happening under the table because of the common threat of Iran and her proxies. And I think that is absolutely fundamental to understanding the region. And I'm not going to pick on kind of old colleagues at the State Department who I served along with and am very fond of and have made great friendships. But I remember seeing in the media that there was a cable, I think it might have been from the U.S. Embassy in Tunis, and it talked about how the United States, the standing on the Arab street, the standing is falling in the Arab world because our support for Israel. It talked about how Israel's relations, with even her Arab allies was failing. And I thought to myself, well, that's actually not accurate. Because until we see any cracks in that security relationship, those bilateral ties, that doesn't mean anything. And I think those are still very valid and still exist today. And if you want to, not to jump into, what happens in the future in terms of a proposed settlement. But if you go down the line to a normalization deal between, then you have an Israeli-Saudi relationship, which becomes overt, and it's transformational, again, in the axis of resistance to the axis of resistance.
Well, and certainly, and I wanted to ask you about post-October 7th, because that was certainly the pre-October 7th trend, right, was the regional integration, the idea that the Israelis and Arab countries were coming together for a lot of reasons, but one of them was the common threat of Iran. The post-October 7th, the idea of normalization between Saudi and Israel, let's just put it, to put it lightly, seems a lot more difficult, right, if not impossible. And for you or anyone else on the panel, how much does this partnership that Marc talks about continue, even when these Arab governments have a real problem with Gaza, with their own public, and not showing at all that they would support Israel in any way? Let's really throw this open to anyone. Yeah.
Sure, I'll start. Since October 7th, I've been to Israel several times. I've been to 4 Gulf states. Under the current circumstances, Israeli-Saudi normalization can't be pursued in a big public way. And remember that at the time, and I think one of the reasons Hamas did what it did on October 7th, it was already planning something, was to undermine normalization. And counter to what you heard in the last panel, the Saudis were demanding real dividends of Israel towards a two-state solution, tangible things. You might a normal person could say, okay, that would be good for the Palestinians. Hamas looked at that because Hamas opposes a two-state solution and had to undermine that. So you're going to have an end to the war and stability in Gaza and maybe some type of role for Palestinian governance. But if you have something like that, then you will have an opportunity for Israeli-Saudi normalization to pick up again. Both parties want it. Parties meaning countries, not political parties. And you don't have any of the Abraham Accords countries stepping out. In fact, you have the Emiratis stepping in with hospitals and with other types of things that they're doing less publicly, sometimes talking about the willingness under certain circumstances to help send forces to stabilize Gaza if certain things happen. And so at the end of the day, I still believe that the number one reason for this is because you mentioned the April attack by Iran. There was never a better commercial for the fact that Iran is a threat to all moderate parties in the region, or for the utility and effectiveness of a common air defense. Now, I'll disagree a little bit with Ken, which is not something I do often, in saying that I think they actually have some pretty formidable capabilities. They only have F-4s, but they've demonstrated a very sophisticated rocket and drone program. They're providing these now to both to Russia, and it's having an impact in Ukraine. We saw what happened at Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia. We saw what happened when these were fired at the airport in Abu Dhabi, sometimes directly by Iran, sometimes by their proxies. You want to go all the way to Israel and you telegraph in advance you're going to do it. We can do things like we did in April, but I got to tell you, I spoke to people in Central Command just beforehand and said, so do you think we're going to be able to knock it all down? And they said, well, we sure hope so, but this was a proof of concept. No one beforehand was saying, oh yeah, no problem, they can shoot whatever they want, we can shoot it all down, and no one can guarantee that the next time will be as successful. So it's a very, very significant threat, but one that can be not fully deterred, but we can affect it, as you heard. When we say, for the first time that I remember ever, we're sending a nuclear submarine to your back door, they got that message. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, shortly after October 7th, went on Al-Manar's television, spent 21 minutes saying, when asked, what do you think about the U.S. naval forces in the Eastern Med, he said, I don't see those forces aren't there, they don't affect me at all, there's nothing about the forces, there are no 21 minutes about how he doesn't see the forces. We got the message. He noticed those U.S. naval forces. So there are things we can do. I appreciated very much what Lisa Monaco said before, but I got to tell you, as a former FBI person and a former U.S. Treasury person, I feel very, very strongly that our responses to this range of threats can't only be prosecutions and designations. And I'm not calling for war, but I think there's a whole lot more diplomatically we can do. The State Department has visa authorities. Do you know how many children of really, really, really bad actors go to school in this country? Go to shop in Paris every other week? There are all kinds of things we can be doing that we're not doing, and to be perfectly blunt and a little bit pithy, The Iranians will continue to send people to this country to assassinate people and all the other threats we've been discussing so long as they can, so long as the cost, if and when there is one, is so little.
Ken, you wanted to respond?
Khamenei has been the supreme leader since 1989. His one overriding concern the entire time has been, we are not going to get into a war with the United States of America. That is, particularly on Iranian soil. We are not going to get into a war with the United States of America. I go on, as probably we all do, Arab television stations, Al Jazeera, whatever. I had a debate with an Iranian professor, and he's, well, we're going to fire missiles, and we're going to do this to the United States. And I just simply said, you do realize the United States has 13,000 combat aircraft, right? I could see the blood drain out of his face. I mean, the guy turned white. They are not going to challenge the United States. Now, I agree, they can fire missiles, they can do this and that, but fundamentally, the United States can basically destroy them in a defined period of time. They do not want war with the United States. Deterrence is a very effective tool. There does not have to be actual use of armed force, but the threat, the perception of armed force is a very valuable tool, and we can debate whether it's been used effectively or enough or what have you.
Well, this is a question that I want to get to on escalation and how their calculus, each group of this axis of resistance has, do they have their own calculus or not? You point out Iran, fundamentally does not want war with the United States, but how is Iran able to manage, for instance, the Houthis doing something that spirals out of control that does lead to that, right? That they fire a missile that hits a strategic target in Tel Aviv, that this spirals out of control, that something that Iran doesn't want. This is for you or anyone on the panel.
Well,
how much do they control it?
the Houthis are an issue that, the Houthis are threatening the freedom of navigation. The United States has said we are going to protect the freedom of navigation since the United States Republic was founded in 1789 with the Constitution. And now the Houthis are threatening freedom of navigation, and we haven't done enough to deter them. But that's a different issue. But I think the fact that Iran has stood down, Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran by Israeli agents, Iran has done nothing. And I think that's been a factor of the communication that, if you push us too far, there are going to be consequences you can't handle. And I think that's a very effective policy tool.
I actually want to add a little bit to this. It's not within Iran's interest to have groups that are really all that autonomous. That doesn't mean that they don't have internal feuds at times behind the scenes, but they have their own way to deconflict. And I think it's often misunderstood. You read a lot of media reports, one group in Iraq was launching rockets when they really didn't want them to. No, they got the order from Khamenei. They just went a little too far in terms of doing it, but it was solved on the back end. So I think there's often a lot of that is missed with this, the Houthis are trying to shut down navigation in the Red Sea. Well, that's still coming from Iran. That's still going there. If they overstep, so if we look at what happened with Gaza, I would make the argument that they were met with catastrophic success. Everything that I was watching in terms of propaganda output, messaging, meetings that were going on, it was quite clear something was going to happen in the Palestinian arena in Israel. It was an obvious thing. But I think they were so successful with it, that's kind of where the Iranians were a little taken off guard. But it doesn't mean that they have not looked at the situation and said, how do we get the best and maximal benefit from it? Because they've now changed a ton of red lines in the entirety of the Middle East, even with lacking power in many cases, because they're trying to play with different political elements that maybe they can put more pressure on.
Can you just talk a little bit about the mechanics of this communication that you say they take sort of strategic directive from Tehran? These groups we know are in regular communication to discuss escalation, to discuss red lines,
Yes.
to discuss what lines not to cross?
There's coordination, but then there's other elements to this as well. So Lebanese Hezbollah, for instance, is an adherent to absolute wilayat al-faqih, which is the ideological framework that a number of core organizations that the Iranians use, like Katab Hezbollah or the Badr organization, they have to follow the orders coming from Khamenei. It's a religious order. They have a taklif shari, which is essentially if you don't obey it, you're disobeying God, essentially. So some of the groups work along within that kind of cohesive structure. But then you have other measures. So if you look at what the Iranians have done, even with groups that have publicly claimed they adhere to this ideology, if they don't follow the rules, sometimes they get busted by other Shia militias. That's happened in Iraq a few times, where a number of militias were shut down when their secretary generals got on TV and said something nasty about the Iranians. One guy, for instance, had his sister arrested when she was in Tehran, and magically he kind of disappeared for a little bit. But I mean, that's one example. But then you look at the Palestinian arena. Palestinian arena is fascinating because you would expect, with no geographic connection at all, how is Iran really maintaining that link? Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad being markedly closer to Iran than Hamas was, both had issues because of the Syrian war and also issues with Yemen. And the Iranians went in and said, one, we're going to pull some funding. Enjoy doing your job in Gaza and running things when you don't have the largesse, the weapons, the training that we're giving you. That's one. Two, we're going to do something that we tried in Iraq, which is creating splinter upon splinter upon splinter. If you look at earlier cases like Muqtada Sadr, who essentially was a proxy for the Iranians, he had, and I'm not joking about this, about 45 groups and commanders that were splintered from him within a 4-year period, just because they wanted to exert different levels of control. So they did that as well. So, I mean, there are carrots and sticks to the way the Iranians work, and it's not all just a religious ideology. It's not all just cash. It's not all just weapons. But you have to look at it in a more holistic sense.
Matt, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just 2 quick points. One is, I completely agree the Iranians don't want war with the United States. But we don't have the luxury of kind of sitting in that space for much longer, because I would argue, unfortunately, when not if, but let's just say if the Iranians become a nuclear threshold state, then it's a whole different ballgame. And they don't have to threaten to go to war with the United States. They're going to be acting as they are now, only on steroids. The second point I want to make is Iran's proxy network, the axis of resistance, whatever you want to call it, is only as capable and effective as it is because of Iranian money and weapons smuggling. This, to me, has to be the post-October 7th world response, right? Think of the Houthis, who are the big overperformer in all of this multi-front war, right? The Houthis were a very big thorn in the Saudi backside, and not a whole lot more than that. The subject of memes and jokes, until they were given the right munitions and given the right training by both Iran and a small number of Hezbollah guys, and look what they've been able to do right now. But imagine if we were to be able to stop Iran from smuggling them more rockets. Imagine, look at what happened with Hamas once the Israelis took control of the Philadelphia corridor. I don't mean this as a commentary on current negotiations of whether they need to hold it or not. That's another story. But the fact remains, once the Israelis took control of the Philadelphia corridor and those smuggling routes from Egypt were shut down, Hamas had 2 problems. One was a weapons and ammunition problem, and the other was a cash problem, because Gaza is a cash economy, and there was a severe liquidity problem. If you're Hamas and you want to send money into the Gaza Strip, that's done through a Hawaladar, and if the Hawaladar doesn't have cash to hand out, you're not getting money. So the biggest leverage we have to throw a wrench in the Iranian threat network is to make it much, much harder for Iran to send certainly weapons and ammunition. Money is a separate issue, very important, a little bit more difficult. And we haven't done anywhere near enough of that. That requires a dedicated set of intelligence streams and things, and we have someone who can speak that far better than I can. I'm not saying it can be done overnight and easy, but if we make a policy decision to do that, we could, and I personally think that is the one thing that would make a difference.
I want to go to the intelligence question because you talk to people after October 7th in the intel world, and most would say, yeah, we stopped collecting on Hamas years ago, right? I mean, it was not a high priority. We sort of outsourced it to the Israelis because why wouldn't we? It's their problem, not ours. Obviously, the priority framework has changed since October 7th, but there has been this movement at the CIA, to take one organization in particular, which has moved, increasingly towards funding, operations in Russia, operations in China, deprioritizing the Middle East, which also reflected general American policy. As much as everyone likes to say we can walk and chew gum at the same time, is that possible, Marc? And what kind of atrophy has there been on these issues at your old organization?
So my first operational desk at CIA in 1997 was the Hamas desk, which of course does not exist. Well, I would imagine there's a task force now, so it exists now. But you know, we have seen, of course, post 9/11, the U.S. government focus obviously shift to Al Qaeda, then to ISIS. But now, with the advent of great power competition, it's shifted east to China. You saw over the weekend Bill Burns, the CIA director, in a conversation with the British intelligence chief, say that 20%, this is actually 20% of the CIA budget is now dedicated to China. And look, we live in a time of finite resources. I mean, you know, it costs money to run the CIA. You have to decide where you send your officers to language training, where you put your officers overseas. And so you are right. Not only did we outsource collection on Hamas to the Israelis, but also we've shifted away from terrorism. And terrorism isn't a problem until it is. And guess what happened on October 7th? An enormous tragedy in Israel, no doubt, but let's not forget 43 Americans died. That's an extraordinary number. If you look at, over my career, which was predominantly dedicated to the counterterrorism fight, I can't think of many kind of events like that. Obviously 9/11, you talk about the Marine Corps barracks bombing in Beirut, but we're talking 43 Americans is an extraordinary number. So the question is, you know, do we have the resources to do this? And in an era where China is the long-term pacing threat, according to DoD, the National Defense Strategy, you know, this is going to be an issue for us. I want to, and with that in mind, so we're talking resources. But another point, and to kind of jump on Matt's point, you know, Iran operates in the gray zone. That's in this area, kind of a little underneath, you know, all-out active war. But the United States government often does not or has not. And you know, I think Matt, you know, talked about some kind of tools in the kit that can be used. But going back to my old job of counterterrorism, I think about our authorities, and that a lot of this has to do with kinetic operations. This is, you know, at the fight against Al Qaeda, the United States government, the intelligence community, CIA in particular, but along with our partners, you know, in JSOC, for example, got really good at manhunting, the find, fix, and finish mission, fusing human intelligence, signals intelligence, SIGINT, and then ISR overhead together to track down and take people off the battlefield. Remember, 43 Americans died on October 7th. So the question I have is, you know, why are we not using those same authorities? Because the same authorities exist. In the counterterrorism world, the findings, the covert action authorities that were signed after, not even before, but really after 9/11, still exist today. And they would apply. It's a policy call not to go down that road. And so I think, you know, there has to be more tools in the toolkit, and we certainly have to be more aggressive. I'll leave one last kind of anecdote, and this is my life of telling stories from the Middle East. It was in Damascus in 2000, it was either 2006 or 2007. I was invited to Libyan National Day. The U.S. Actually had reestablished relations with Libya as a counterterrorism partner, amazingly enough. And so I went as the representative of the U.S. Embassy there, and I walked in and I saw the Libyan ambassador. He came up to me and he said, "It's great that there's someone here from the U.S. government." And I said, "Okay, why?" He said, "Well, there's two guests here who are a little concerned about the gathering." And I said, "Who?" He said, "Khalid Mishal and Ahmed Jibril. We're both at the same event." And the Libyan ambassador looked at me right in the eye and he said, "We just think that we're safer all here because you're here. Israel is not going to bomb this." Now, of course, you know, but I say it, but he was serious in the sense of that's the deterrence that we need. There has to be that fear. Iran and the proxies need to fear that there is a Hellfire missile coming, that there's something, and I'm not sure, and I'm not here to criticize policy, but I'm not sure that we have done that effectively. Well, I sort of criticize policy. But we haven't done that effectively. And again, Marc, the point is there are authorities to do this. It's a policy decision not to do it right now.
If I may add something too, some of the organizations, the most effective networks that they have are often 5 to 20 guys. We're not talking about all that many.
And some of the, which are those? What are?
I could rally off 8 different groups in Iraq.
And effective in what sense?
So often you're dealing with familial networks. I mean, Matt didn't even say this for Lebanese Hezbollah. Look at what's happened with them, where they've become a familial dynasty of sorts for Nasrallah and for his family. All of the key operations that were really going overseas, all of a sudden were Nasrallah relatives. In fact, there was a Nasrallah, Muqtada Sadr actually visited the funeral for this nephew of his who was killed in Iraq quote-unquote, training the Hashd al-Shaabi, but he was actually doing frontline fighting and helping equip Kataib Hezbollah. So a lot of these are really tight networks that the Iranians have really worked very, very hard. I mean, you look at the example of somebody like Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. We talk about when Qasem Soleimani was killed, but I would make the argument that killing Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was far more effective in causing issues within their network of Iraqi groups. So you have to look for kind of key people. It's not always the leadership. It's not always the secretary general. Sometimes it's that second or third member who's really the glue who's running the organization. And frankly, I mean, I think if you're looking at Telegram, you're looking at Facebook and what these guys are posting, you go, wow, that must be that's some militia. That's like 1,000 guys. Often it's not. It's a recruitment. They will find the way to kind of pay them. They'll just churn people out. There are guys who have been through, I'm not even joking, I talked to one guy who's been in 10 different Shia militias, deployed to Syria 5 times, and he was doing it as a vacation. So you don't need to kill someone like that. But there are kind of core leadership elements that are there that really you can kind of hone down on, and then if they have a car accident, whoops.
So let me just to illustrate what Phillip is saying, I mean, the Iraqi Shia militias were firing at U.S. troops and bases at Ain al-Assad base in the west. What caused them to stand down? Mr. Biden found one operational leader driving in his car in Baghdad and sent a hellfire and took him out. And then they stopped. And now, they've done a little bit since then, but that put them on their back foot. It does work. It's not a tool to trot out casually, but it does succeed when it's focused and appropriate.
But it's not a policy, right? So we did that after like 70-something plots. We stopped them for a while until they started up again. I put this incident, I put the Qasem Soleimani hit. These are not policies. So what I'm saying is we need to understand that Iran and its network is a real threat to us and our interests, and we need an actual policy to go ahead and deal with it and not find a way, whoa, it's gotten too big, we got to hit somebody now. And I think that part of that is also understanding why they're doing what they're doing, where they're doing. If we can go back to the Iranian external operations for a moment, I think a lot of people put all the external operations that are happening in one basket because it's one tactic that's being used, but it's basically 5 different plot lines. Iran targeting current and former U.S. officials to avenge the death of Qasem Soleimani is one plot line. Targeting Israelis over the shadow, now explicit war they've had, that's another one. Targeting Iranian dissidents is another one. Targeting Jews, as they've done in a few instances in the United States, and a plot just exposed in France and Germany, Jews who are not Israelis, it's another plot line. But then we got to take a big step back, see that all those plot lines are happening around the world, that things are happening in the region, and we have to develop holistic strategies. And I think that when it comes to their activities in the region, we actually have it within our capabilities to significantly frustrate and disrupt their smuggling rat lines. And if these groups, whether it's 6 guys or 6,000 guys, can't get the weapons and money, then without that support from Iran, they are nowhere near the threat that they are today. And today, these are a series of real threats.
Okay, but that's an extension of military policy. I mean, that is also use of the military. It
includes the military, sure,
right.
And I think there's a place for kinetic operations in disrupting certain things. The Israelis have had a policy of war between the wars, taking out shipments, in Syria. We should be doing some of that. But I'd argue that not all of it, and maybe not even most of it, is necessarily military. There's a huge piece of it either way, whether it's kinetic action at the end of the day or another type of action that's going to come down to a huge reliance on the intelligence.
Can I just,
but
we
you're
have
still arguing for a more robust policy, though.
Yes.
Okay.
So we have about 1 more minute, and I wanted to get anyone else to respond to Philip's comment about the catastrophic success of October 7th from the Iranian point of view. And I hope I didn't mischaracterize you, but this idea that maybe Iran saw what happened on October 7th, and while they may not have known the detailed planning, that maybe what happened got a little too hot for them, and they saw the repercussions of what happened, and perhaps thought that they could be, it should be dialed back.
I'm not of the belief that, just based on how they built up their relationship with Hamas, PIJ, and the almost 10 other groups that were involved in this, in fact, they were the only country bolstering these other organizations, that they didn't have some detailed understanding. But the catastrophic success comes when you kind of expect your foe to be a little bit more robust in the response. And maybe they wanted something a bit smaller. That's kind of where I was going with that.
Matt, do you want to respond quickly?
Yeah, look, I've written the same thing as catastrophic success, but not from an Iranian perspective. Iran is loving this. The catastrophic success was for Hamas. I think Hamas thought that more people would be killed at the border, not as many people would get by. They wouldn't have killed quite as many, captured quite as many. They were trying to do something huge, something that would disrupt the whole system, upend the whole system. But I think what they ended up doing was more than they even thought. And I think it's possible that they didn't anticipate the Israeli response would be quite as much as it was, but this was the goal. The goal was to get the Israelis to come in. You know, in the words of a Hamas person, I feel dirty letting the words cross my lips, but quote unquote, we need the blood of Palestinians to spill to get public opinion. That was the goal. I think it was Hamas that had catastrophic success. Iran is giddy.
Well, Iran has taken advantage of that. Their broader strategic goals, yes, I would agree. But I don't think, again, there's no love lost for Hamas and being able to put their own guys in there. But I would say that this, probably even crossed in terms of what they necessarily wanted. They didn't want a replay of what happened in 2006. You can quite clearly see that. Lebanese Hezbollah responded to, quote unquote, defend Hamas. People forget this, that kidnapping operation was because of the operations that were going on in Gaza. They didn't want a replay of that. But I do think that they have won a grand kind of strategic victory, which they were going to play anyway, and I think we've acquiesced to it.
So on that note, we're going to have to end. We're out of time. Next time, we're going to have to get a chattier panel. Thanks to all of you, and thanks again to Soufan Center.